The kiss of betrayal still burns on my lips. The weight of the 30 pieces of silver seems to crush my soul. My name is Judas Iscariot, and this is the story of how I became the most hated man in history. But let's not start at the end. To understand my fall, you need to know my rise. You need to know how an ordinary boy from Kerioth became a disciple of Jesus Christ, and later, his betrayer. I was born in a time of turmoil and expectation. The air in Judea was thick with the weight of Roman oppression and the fervent hope for the coming Messiah. My father, Simon, was a modest merchant, struggling to support our family in a world where Roman taxes drained every last drop of our savings. I vividly remember one night, I must have been about 5 years old, when I heard my parents speaking in hushed tones after dinner. "We can't pay the taxes this month, Simon," my mother said, her voice trembling with worry. "They will take everything we have." My father's response is etched in my memory. "Then we will pray harder, Rebecca. The Messiah will come. He must come." That conversation planted in me the seeds of revolt and expectation that would shape my life. I grew up with my eyes turned to the sky, awaiting the promised deliverer, and with clenched fists against the injustice I saw around me. My childhood was a mix of diligent study and bitter observation of the world. I spent my days immersed in the scriptures, absorbing every word of the prophets, every promise of redemption. At night, I listened to the elders' tales of Israel's glory days, of mighty kings and the promise of the return of that greatness. But the reality outside our small home was quite different. I saw families stripped of everything they had because they couldn't pay the taxes. I witnessed the brutality of Roman soldiers who treated our people like animals. Every injustice I saw fueled my anger and desire for change. At 12 years old, I had my bar mitzvah. I remember standing before the congregation, my voice trembling slightly as I read from the Torah. After the ceremony, old Rabbi Ezra called me aside. "You have a fire in your eyes, Judas," he said, his wrinkled hand resting on my shoulder. "Use it wisely. The Messiah will come, and when he does, he will need strong men by his side." Those words became my mantra in the years that followed. I studied with an intensity that even surprised my teachers. It wasn't just knowledge I sought, but power, the power to change the world, to free my people. At 18, I could no longer bear the confines of Kerioth. I felt that my destiny was calling me to something greater. On a starry night, I announced to my parents my decision to leave for Jerusalem. "But son," my mother protested, tears in her eyes, "what will you do there?" "I will prepare," I replied, my voice filled with a confidence I wasn't sure I truly felt. "The Messiah will come, and when he does, I will be ready to serve him." My father looked at me for a long time before speaking. "May God protect you, Judas, and may you find what you are looking for." The journey to Jerusalem was an adventure in itself. For the first time, I saw the world beyond my small village. I crossed lush valleys and scorching deserts. I saw the misery of the poor and the opulence of the rich. Every sight, every experience only strengthened my conviction that the world desperately needed change. Jerusalem was a shock to the senses. The bustle of the holy city, the smell of incense mixed with the odor of animals and crowds, the imposing sight of the temple shining in the sun, all of this left me stunned and amazed. In the first days, I wandered the streets, absorbing everything I could. I slept in cheap inns, sharing space with pilgrims and beggars. I heard stories from all parts of the known world, feeding my mind with new ideas and perspectives. It was during this period that I had my first real encounter with Roman power. I was in the market when I saw a group of soldiers confronting an old fruit vendor. They accused him of tax evasion, but it was clear the man barely had enough to feed himself. Without thinking, I intervened. "Leave him alone," I shouted. "Can't you see he has nothing?" The centurion turned to me, his eyes cold as steel. "Mind your own life, Jew," he growled, "or the next person to pay will be you." That moment crystallized everything I felt about Roman oppression. The injustice, the cruelty, the total lack of compassion, all of this ignited in me a flame of revolt that would never completely die out. It was in this state of mind that I found the zealots. I heard about them in whispers in the dark alleys of the city, In hushed conversations in the synagogues, they were revolutionaries, actively fighting against Roman rule. To a young man full of anger and a desire for change like me, they were irresistible. My first encounter with the group was at a secret meeting on the outskirts of the city. The leader, a man named Barabbas, spoke with a passion that inflamed my soul. "For how long will we allow these pagan dogs to trample on our sacred land?" he shouted. "The Messiah will not come while we stand idly by. We must prepare the way for him with our own hands." His words resonated deeply within me. Finally, I thought, here were men of action, not just scholars debating in the synagogues. I joined the group that very night, ready to fight for my people's freedom. The following months were a roller coaster of emotions and actions. I participated in raids on tax collection posts, helped plan ambushes against isolated Roman patrols. The adrenaline of the fight, the feeling of doing something concrete for the cause, was intoxicating. But over time, I began to question our methods. After a particularly violent attack, in which several innocent civilians were injured, I felt a deep unease. Were we really doing God's will, or were we just feeding an endless cycle of violence? It was in this moment of doubt that I first heard of Jesus of Nazareth. The rumors about this Galilean preacher were spreading like wildfire through the city. They spoke of incredible miracles, blind men seeing again, paralytics getting up and walking, even the dead being raised. At first I was skeptical. I had seen many charlatans taking advantage of people's faith, but something about this Jesus intrigued me. The accounts of his teachings, his compassion for the poor and marginalized, his biting criticism of corrupt religious leaders, all of this resonated with something deep in my soul. I decided I needed to see this man for myself. I followed the rumors to Galilee, where I finally found him preaching on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. What I saw and heard that day changed my life forever. Jesus was nothing like I expected. He had none of the pomp of the Pharisees or the fiery rhetoric of the Zealots. His voice was gentle but carried an authority I had never witnessed before. He spoke of a kingdom that was not of this world, of loving enemies, of turning the other cheek. His words challenged everything I thought I knew about God and his plan for Israel. I stood there, paralyzed, feeling as if every word was directed specifically at me, exposing the contradictions and anger in my heart. When he finished speaking, I approached, trembling. Jesus looked at me, and in that moment, I felt as if he could see through my soul, knowing every thought, every hidden motive. "Judas," he said, though I had not introduced myself, "you have been seeking the kingdom of God in the wrong places. Come and see." With those simple words, my life changed forever. I abandoned everything, my plans, my dreams of personal greatness, my armed struggle, and became one of the 12 disciples chosen by Jesus. The 3 years that followed were an incredible journey, filled with wonders and challenges that would test my faith and character to the limit. I saw Jesus perform miracles that defied understanding, multiplying loaves and fish to feed crowds, calming storms with a word, healing incurable diseases with a touch. But more than the miracles, it was his teachings that fascinated and sometimes confused me. Jesus spoke of a kingdom based on love and forgiveness, not on force and vengeance. He preached non-violence in a world where violence was the norm. However, as our fame grew, so did the challenges and expectations. The crowds wanted to make Jesus an earthly king, a political liberator who would drive out the Romans. Part of me still longed for that, still dreamed of the glory of a restored Israel. But Jesus constantly frustrated those expectations. I vividly remember a night after he had fed more than 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. The crowd was frenzied, ready to proclaim him king right there. The other disciples and I were elated. Finally, I thought Jesus would assume his role as leader and liberator. But to my astonishment, he withdrew alone to the mountain, refusing the crown that was offered to him. That night, I argued heatedly with the other disciples. "How can he waste such an opportunity?" I argued. With this kind of power and popular support, we could drive out the Romans in a matter of days. Peter, always the most vocal, rebuked me. "Don't you understand yet, Judas? The kingdom that Jesus came to establish is greater than politics and earthly power." His words deeply irritated me. How could anything be greater than the liberation of our people? I began to suspect that maybe Jesus wasn't as brave or determined as I initially thought. My growing frustration was exacerbated by my position as the group's treasurer. Jesus had entrusted me with the responsibility of managing the finances, a task that initially filled me with pride. But as our fame grew and donations increased, I felt the weight of temptation. I started small, a few shekels here and there, just enough to ensure some extra comfort for myself. I rationalized that I deserved it, given all the work I was doing. But soon, those small diversions were no longer enough. Money became an obsession, a way to feel in control in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. The incident with Mary in Bethany was the turning point. When she anointed Jesus' feet with that expensive perfume, all I could think about was the wasted value. 300 denarii, almost a year's wages for a common laborer. "What a waste!" I exclaimed. "This perfume could have been sold and the money given to the poor." Jesus' rebuke hit me like a slap. "Leave her alone," he said. "She has done a beautiful thing for me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." His words seemed to expose my hypocrisy, my greed thinly disguised as concern for the poor. The shame and anger I felt in that moment planted the final seeds of my betrayal. In the days that followed, my mind was in turmoil. Jesus spoke more and more about his impending death, about being delivered into the hands of men. Part of me wanted to believe it was just another of his enigmatic parables, but something in his tone, in the sadness in his eyes, told me he was speaking literally. It was in this state of confusion and despair that I began to consider the idea of turning him over to the authorities. My reasoning was a toxic mix of conflicting motivations. Part of me still believed that if placed in a life-or-death situation, Jesus would finally reveal his divine power and establish his kingdom. Another part was simply tired of waiting, frustrated with what I saw as Jesus' indecision. And, I must admit, there was also the money. 30 pieces of silver was not a fortune, but it represented security, an exit plan in case my scheme went wrong. It was the price of a slave, a bitter irony I only realized much later. The night of the Last Supper was torment. Sitting there with the other disciples, listening to Jesus talk about his broken body and shed blood, I felt as if every word was directed at me. When he announced that one of us would betray him, I felt the others' eyes on me. Did they suspect? Was I that transparent? My question, "Is it I, Master?" was a last desperate act of denial, a pathetic attempt to convince myself that there was still a way back. Jesus' response, "You have said so," sealed my fate. The kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane was the moment my world collapsed. The instant my lips touched Jesus' face, the full madness of my plan became clear. There would be no divine revelation, no cosmic display of power, just a gentle, loving man being led to his death because of me. The look Jesus gave me in that moment will be etched in my memory forever. There was no anger in his eyes, no accusation, just a deep sadness and a compassion I did not deserve. "Friend," he said softly, "do you betray me with a kiss?" Those words hit me like a physical blow. Friend. After everything I had done, he still called me a friend. The enormity of my betrayal hit me with full force at that moment. As the guards took Jesus away, I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The other disciples fled in panic, but I remained there like a pillar of salt, watching the consequences of my actions unfold before my eyes. The hours that followed were a blur of guilt and despair. I wandered the streets of Jerusalem like a possessed man, my mind endlessly replaying every moment of the past 3 years. Every teaching of Jesus, every miracle I had witnessed, every opportunity I had to do the right thing, all of it now condemned me. I heard the rumors spreading through the city. Jesus was being judged. The crowd was calling for his crucifixion. The same people who had shouted Hosanna just a few days before were now demanding his blood. And I was responsible for all of this. The weight of the 30 pieces of silver in my pouch seemed to increase with every step. The money I had coveted so eagerly now disgusted me. I ran back to the chief priests, desperate to undo what I had done. "I have sinned," I shouted, throwing the coins at their feet. "I betrayed innocent blood." But they only laughed at me. "What does that matter to us?" they said with disdain. "That's your problem." At that moment I realized the true nature of those I had served. They didn't care about justice or the will of God. I had been nothing more than a tool in their hands, disposable and insignificant. I left the temple staggering, my mind a whirlwind of remorse and self-recrimination. The streets of Jerusalem, once so familiar, now seemed a strange and hostile maze. Every face I saw seemed to accuse me. Every voice I heard seemed to shout, "Traitor." It was then that I heard the cries coming from the direction of Golgotha. Jesus was being led to his crucifixion. For a moment I considered running there, throwing myself at the foot of the cross and begging for forgiveness. But the cowardice that led me to betrayal once again overcame me. I could not face what I had done. Instead, my steps led me out of the city. I wandered aimlessly, leaving Jerusalem behind, until I found myself in a solitary field. An ancient olive tree stood alone in the center of the field, its twisted branches seeming to stretch in accusation against the sky. It was there, under that tree, that I made my final decision. I could not live with what I had done. The weight of my betrayal was simply too great to bear. With trembling hands, I prepared a rope. As I tied it to a strong branch, my mind went back to the first day I met Jesus. I remembered his gentle voice calling me, the light in his eyes when he spoke of the kingdom of God. How could I have betrayed that love? How could I have been so blind? Tears streamed down my face as I placed the rope around my neck. "Jesus," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion, "forgive me." I did not know what I was doing. My final thoughts were a chaotic mix of regret, shame, and a tiny glimmer of hope. Hope that somehow my death could atone for my sin. Hope that perhaps the merciful God Jesus spoke of so much could find a place in his heart for a repentant traitor. And then, with one last breath of desperation, I took the final step. Now, looking back on my life, I see a tapestry of wrong choices, missed opportunities, and lessons unlearned. My story is a warning about the dangers of pride, greed, and lack of faith. It is a reminder that even those closest to the light can succumb to darkness if they are not vigilant. But I also hope that my story may serve a greater purpose, that it may illustrate the depth of Jesus' love and forgiveness which extends even to his traitor, that it may encourage others to examine their own hearts, to recognize their failings, and to seek redemption while there is still time. For in the end, Jesus' message was not about political power or earthly dominion, as I so wrongly believed. It was about inner transformation, about a kingdom built in the hearts of men through love, compassion, and forgiveness. My life ended in despair, but the story does not end with me. The sacrifice of Jesus, which I inadvertently helped to precipitate, paved the way for the salvation of many, and perhaps in some way that I cannot comprehend even for someone like me. This is my full story, the story of Judas Iscariot. A story of great hopes, terrible mistakes, and late repentance. May those who hear it learn from my errors and choose a better path. May they understand the true meaning of Jesus' words and live a life worthy of his call. And so, I close my account, not with a justification for my actions, but with a plea for understanding and an appeal for reflection. May my story serve as a beacon, guiding others away from the dangers of betrayal and towards the light of the love and forgiveness that Jesus came to bring to the world.